Hello and welcome to Behind Clean Lines, a podcast by NGI. You know, when people talk about contamination in food factories, oftentimes they associate it with microbes and microbial growth, but there's actually something that's even worse, and that thing is called biofilm, and that is also what we're talking about today. And lucky for me, we have someone really clever on this subject in the studio with us on a video link. Deb Smith, you are the, what did I write down? Global hygiene specialist and microbiologist at Vikan, and Vikan delivers cleaning equipment for the food industry. Hello, Deb.
Hi, how
are you with me?
Yes, loud and clear.
I'm good. I'm good. Now, like I said, biofilm is actually it's even worse than just microbes. Why is biofilm so important to know something about?
Well, biofilms basically where the microbes, the individual microbes, have a chance to settle onto a surface, grow into colonies, and then cover themselves with a protective slime. So whereas we can combat individual cells quite easily with the cleaning and disinfection that we normally do in day-to-day food safety practices, when they have this protective film over the top, they actually become a lot more resistant to that type of control that we normally apply.
And just to set the scene for the listener, do we have any examples of incidents where biofilm and microbes in biofilm have been the cause of any contamination?
Sadly, yes. And it seems to be a recurring theme. So I think the earliest example that I can think of dates back to 2008. So when I was actually working at Camden BRI at that time, but there was a huge listeria outbreak in Canada, and that was associated with cooked sliced meats produced by a company called Maple Leaf Foods. Now, the outbreak was associated with a bacteria called Listeria monocytogenes, which is a really nasty one. It kills more people per infection than any other microorganism. So it's a particular concern in the food industry. It's also very much associated with cooked chilled meats. So what happened with the incident in Canada was that they traced the source of the listeria back to a biofilm within the meat slicing machines. And what was happening was when the meat was being sliced, the biofilm was releasing the listeria bacteria onto the slicing blades and basically inoculating every slice of sliced meat that came out of that slicer. No. Yeah, not good. Especially as there were 24 fatalities from that incident and 57 cases of listeriosis. So it was a pretty major outbreak. And of course, not only in terms of the cost to people's lives, but also the cost to the business in terms of the actual financial cost, but their cost in loss of reputation.
That's a terrible case. Or it's not a terrible case, but it's a good case, but it's a terrible situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, unfortunately, they're not few and far between. They do reoccur.
All right, because I was just about to ask. I know that the hygienic standards are different in the US and Canada, and compared to Europe, where we have the EHEG standards. Are there also European examples of
yes,
similar severity?
Yeah, I can give you an example from Denmark, which would probably be quite relevant. Especially as I actually have eaten this product for breakfast quite often when I'm over in Denmark. But now let me think, when this was 2014. So this was a case where a cooked meat sausage, I think they call it rullepusser, so it's apologies for my pronunciation. But yeah,
close enough.
Was it close enough? Thank you, thanks. So that was obviously prepared and sliced, and unfortunately this was served to people in an elder home who obviously are older and some of them had health conditions, and they are a particularly vulnerable group for listeria. And
course.
in that case, I think, I might have to check my notes here. Let's have a look. 17 deaths were associated with that in 2014, so not only 10 years ago. And when they investigated that case, they traced that back to a biofilm in the drain of the area where the cooked meat sausage was stored. So obviously, somehow there'd been aerosols and droplets that come from that drain that carried the listeria onto the cooked meat and then was then passed on to the people in the elder home.
And now I think with this really sets the scene to me that this is something that food companies and also OEMs producing for the food industry, they really take biofilm seriously. But you mentioned just very shortly what it actually is, but can you kind of steelman that for me just a little bit? Because what is the difference actually between just microbes and biofilm?
Well, the key difference really is that they've got this protective layer. So when let's say the free microbes settle onto the surface, they gradually accumulate and they build up this biofilm layer, which is the slime that protects them. And we know from studies that biofilm protective layer can make them much more resistant, as I said, to the cleaning and disinfection chemicals. There was a study which it's quite a long time ago now, but it's still very relevant. So hypochlorous acid, which we also still use as a disinfectant, is very effective against free cells. But in a biofilm, the cells in that biofilm can be up to 3,000 times more resistant to attack by hypochlorous acid than free cells. So the key thing is that it gives them this ability to protect themselves against a lot of the things that we normally use to deal with them.
And how do they form? I'm guessing patches of biofilm?
Well, kind of. So you say that the individual cells, individual cells are with us all the time. They're floating around in the air. They're shed from our skin. People are a great source of bacteria. So you have to have people in a food factory. The bacteria they bring in with them go into the air. They settle onto a surface. If you give them time, and if you give them moisture, and if you give them nutrients, all of which you very often find in a food factory, they will grow into these small colonies, and then they'll form what's called a monolayer. And then if they're given more time and they're not disturbed, which is quite often the case with biofilms, they will start to form many layers. And the more layers they form, the more resistant they get to what we would normally do to get rid of them. And then when they get to a kind of mature stage, they then start to produce this, what we call an extracellular or polymetric layer, which is this slime that covers them over. And then the whole thing repeats as a cycle. So when they get old, the biofilms break down, they release the cells back into the environment again, and the cycle repeats.
And when you say if we leave them for some extra time, how long time are we talking? Are we talking weeks? Are we talking longer or shorter?
So that really does depend on the makeup of the biofilm, so which microorganisms make up the actual biofilm itself. And we now know, again, through some of the sort of more modern techniques that we're using, that can be very different. Different biofilms can be made up of different bacteria, and those different bacteria have different growth rates. They need different environmental temperatures, different food sources to produce. So different bacteria, also the different temperature in the environment that they're in, and the availability of the moisture and the food, all of those will affect the growth rate. So it's quite tricky to say for certain, but we do know that the reason that we clean in a food factory after 8 hours or 16 hours when we do a shift change is because that limits the development of the biofilm to the sort of the monolayer stage. So before it really gets mature and covered by that biofilm. the ones that we worry about most are the ones that you can't see and that go undetected for sometimes years. And they can then obviously be very mature, and they can lead to a persistent problem with contamination in the environment, and you won't know where that's coming from.
So you can easily have a biofilm that is completely see-through or transparent, that you can't see with the naked eye, or...
Not see-through or transparent, but hidden. So it might be inside a piece of pipework or behind a wall cladding.
Okay.
And then from there, it gradually seeps out from there and then spreads around the rest of the environment.
Yeah. And we talked about this just before turning on the microphones. There's something about when you have the microbes gathered together inside of this biofilm, they can somehow communicate. You also mentioned that they produce this outer layer. This sounds so alien to me. Can you try and elaborate that just a little bit?
Well, the outer layer is definitely one of the protective mechanisms we've known about for a long time. But again, once we've got these molecular techniques and we're looking at the microbes on a molecular level, we realise that they actually do a thing called quorum sensing, which is where they generate a chemical that gradually builds up within the biofilm. And when that chemical reaches a particular level, it switches on different genes in different microbes. And then they can form more defense mechanisms against the things that we normally use to get rid of them. So, for instance, they can become more virulent, more defensive against the chemicals that we'd use. They can form stronger matrices. They produce little filaments that tie them together, called pili, or stick them more firmly onto a surface. Or they can actually develop a thing called a flagella, which lets them move. So they can actually swim. They can swim away from where they are, and they can spread by swimming as well as dispersal through the air. So, yeah, they're very tricky, these biofilms, and very clever.
And now that we're all shocked, I'm shocked anyway, how would you mitigate the risk when you're in a food factory? Cleaning, but you say that they can kind of train themselves to, stand up to that cleaning method. What would you do?
Well, there's a number of things, and you mentioned about the different standards between the US and the Europe, and I think you also mentioned EHEG at one point. Mm-hmm. So a key factor really for trying to minimise the presence of biofilms is to have equipment and facilities that are hygienically designed. So that means not having equipment or buildings where the bacteria can hide in the first place. So making them easy to clean, where there's no nooks and crannies for the bacteria to accumulate or be difficult to remove. Smooth surface finishes, that kind of thing. So that's one of the key things. That's a good starting point to have the good hygienic design. Then there's the cleaning and disinfection. Obviously, you have to have your validated methods. I think also having a good maintenance program in place so that you just don't put it in place for once and then forget it. You have to go back and review it and make sure that things haven't changed. And then also having a really good food safety culture, where people understand what the risk from biofilms is. They're trained in what they have to do to get rid of it, and that they actually do that, and they're rewarded and acknowledged for doing that. So there's a multi-stage approach to it.
And I think that's also something that we'll talk about in the next episode, where you will join us, also where we take a more practical approach to combating biofilms and what can companies do, and what strategies can you kind of enforce. I think that's it for now. Deb Smith, thank you so much for joining us for this episode on biofilm.
You're very welcome.
And to the listener out there, if you enjoyed this episode, please do share it or like it. Share it with a colleague or a friend, who you think would be interested as well. If you have any questions or any topics that you want us to discuss on this podcast, reach out to us on podcast@ngi-global.com. And that was podcast@ngi-global.com. I think with that, I'm just only thing left to say is thank you so much for listening.